Hi, my name is Joe Kramer. I'm a high school physics teacher and a writer on OpenSciEd High School Physics Unit 1. I'm going to be talking about Lesson 4 here. I love this lesson for how elegantly it layers on new pieces of the puzzle at the core of the unit. So students have to wrestle for the first time with how we choose what sources to use for electricity, the card ranking task of electric sources, combined with the gallery walk of other groups' rankings and the consensus discussion of what we mean by reliability, fit together really perfectly. And then we get into some very sophisticated graph analysis that challenges students in the best way. So first, some details on how we get here from lesson 3. We look at these graphs of electricity production in yellow and predicted demand in black, and we figure out that the power company clearly needs to increase and decrease how much electrical energy they produce to match what people are using. And we see that during the storm in 2021, predicted demand went way up. People wanted to heat their homes, and the power company saw that coming, but the production couldn't keep up with the energy that people needed or wanted. So we're wondering which sources are used in Texas and which sources failed during the storm. Who can we blame this on? Was it the natural gas plants that failed? Was it the wind plants that failed? Let's look more closely. An overview of the lesson at a glance. This lesson should take about 2 days and about 40 minutes or less of materials preparation. There are 3 main sense-making chunks that I'll look at more closely here. First, in the beginning of day 1, we look at a map of Texas, which type of power plants are in the state, and we get more detail about those types of sources on cards. We use those cards to rank sources on reliability in our groups, and then we look at other groups' rankings. So we see that other groups ranked differently from us, and we wonder what factors other groups might have used in their ranking. So we come together as a class to discuss what reliability means when we consider all the factors that various groups considered. And we see that it's useful to think about reliability at different timescales. A source that's reliable day to day may not be reliable over generations and vice versa. Then, thinking more about reliability in the short term, we're wondering about how these different sources actually performed during the storm. So on day 2, we look at production data broken down by energy source, both during the storm and during a normal year, to see how different types of power plants actually performed. And we figure out that all sources dropped in production, but some sources actually performed surprisingly well compared to a normal year, and some sources didn't perform so well. We set up all these different factors in a decisions matrix so that we can rank in a more sophisticated way which sources we want to use in the future and make more informed decisions about this complex issue. So, in summary, we figure out that in Texas, a wide variety of sources are used for electricity, including natural gas and wind and coal and solar and others. The reliability of an energy source is a complex idea, and different people have different perspectives on what make the source reliable, especially if we look at it from different timescales. And making decisions about complex issues like energy production requires us to define criteria for success carefully. Some of these criteria compete directly with each other, and we still have to wade through those criteria to make a smart decision. Some key moments from this lesson. First, this ranking task is a key moment in lesson 4. We see that Texas uses a lot of natural gas, wind, and solar from this map, and then we get more information about these sources on these cards. For example, is the source dispatchable, meaning can the power company increase or decrease the output to match demand when we're using that source? Capacity factor means the percent of time that a plant is putting out maximum power. So this is very, very low for solar, for example, because solar cells don't work at night. Uh, During this ranking task, diversity of rankings is really, really good. We want to encourage a few groups in the room, and usually there will be some, to rank reliability considering a longer time scale. So, for example, gas and coal may be considered unreliable over decades or generations because the resource may run out. This leads to a very rich discussion when we meet together as a class to think about our consensus definition of reliability. Next, when we introduce these graphs of electricity production, we use a move called a stand and talk that is really motivational. I'll talk more about that a little bit later. But it's important to point out the stacked area graphs and the line graphs show the same data. They show it in different ways and it looks complex on no matter how you show it. But seeing these two perspectives is really, really helpful. Um, when we introduce the decisions matrix, we want to identify like high efficiency or low impact on people as a criteria. We don't want to give ratings yet. We'll come back to that a little bit later in the unit. Where do we go from here? We're wondering how these different types of power plants actually create electrical energy in the wires. We see that these different sources can all create electrical energy, but we don't have information on what makes them really different from each other, like how these plants actually work. So that's where we go in lesson 5. Some tips and tricks about how to manage materials in this lesson. First, I like to print these energy source cards out on half sheets, double-sided. They're still legible, but this makes them small enough that we can just leave them in a folder at each table so students have access to them throughout the unit. I find the easiest way to do this is to open slides energy source cards to print. This is a slides document. And then you delete the first and the last info slides and rearrange the slides together in pairs of 2. So first the text side are arranged together, and then the energy diagram side are arranged together. When we print these, we go to print preview, hand out 2 slides, and then we print them using portrait mode. And then we just cut them in half. This is how I like to do it. Next, groups need to show which direction is high reliability in their rankings. So I do this with a big arrow, or I give them a post-it to label high or low. Remember, diversity in our rankings here makes for a more interesting discussion later. So as students are doing their rankings, you can walk around and have conversations with them to help support that diversity of rankings. Next, I mentioned the stand and talk before. Um, this is a move where we ask students to stand and pair up with a student who is not at their table. They don't get the handout that we're looking at until they pair up with somebody. So just this move on its own can be quite motivating, which is important because these graphs are very, very tricky. I will encourage you to not try to jump in and clarify what the graphs mean. Let students figure this out themselves. Yes, the graphs are very tricky, but students can figure them out. Start with what do you notice, and then let the dialogue build from there. Don't correct them immediately when they assume that the stacked area graph shows that wind is producing more than natural gas. It is not. Natural gas is producing way, way more than anything else, but let students figure that out. Um, Next, I like to copy the full sets of both the line graphs and the stacked area graphs into my slides so that I can post these slides and point them out as students discuss various features. Some details about how to manage terms. We build this term reliability. We spend a lot of time actually coming up with a definition. And other words that we encounter include dispatchability, capacity factor, power, efficiency. All of these are on the energy source cards. And then we see these stacked area graphs for the first time. We do reference our consensus model, and we create this decisions matrix, which we'll keep in our binder and then use again in lesson 10. Um, I like to, as I said, keep a full set of energy source cards at each table because students do, in fact, pull them out and use them. Um, Lastly, just some big takeaways. I'll say again, diversity of rankings when we're talking about reliability is good. It makes for a richer discussion if students don't all agree on their rankings, and gives students time with the stand and talk discussion of stacked area and line graphs. They can figure it out. I promise you that the discussion will be rich as long as you see it as your role to support their figuring out their own sense making rather than explaining it for them. I'll see you again in lesson 5 when we talk about generators.